Welcome to our live stream today, broadcasting to you from the McCullough Foundation offices in Dallas, Texas. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, and I'm welcomed by John Leake, also a member of the McCullough Foundation, one of our officers, and we have a great pleasure in having live in studio Dr. Vibeke Manniche from Copenhagen, Denmark. Vibeke, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
And John, welcome.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, it's a great time here in Dallas to ring in a new era of medical freedom, a new era of insight, and to bring independent investigation to Dallas, Texas, the United States, and the world at large. And our topic today is going to be global birth rates and fertility. But first, let's have Dr. Manniche introduce herself to the audience.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm a Danish doctor, MD, PhD, and we have been doing research for the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years into side effects, with the corona vaccine, so the vaccinations against COVID-19. And we have done some studies about batch dependency, and we are at the moment doing several studies about all-cause mortality, but this one is actually about infertility and the association to the coronavac status of the woman before contraception. So this is like showing that there seems to be a negative association between whether you were vaccinated against corona before you got pregnant.
Well, so what was your first signal that there might be a problem?
I think the first signal was that we have been following the numbers very closely since the start of the corona scandal and all, how many were infected and all that. And then we looked into death, how many died out of corona or died, in all big numbers. And then we looked into how many were born. And it turned out that in December 21, suddenly we had a sudden decline of birth rate in Denmark. Denmark is a small country. We only have like a population about 6 million people. So, and we have a very good overview of the public health, the numbers, how many are born, how many, on a daily basis, we can follow that. And then we saw that there was a rapid decline, literally December 21. And having in mind that the corona vaccines were pushed to the whole population, the adults and also the children, and that the pushing was very strong. Like, you needed to get the vaccination, whether you were a child, whether you were a young person, whether you were even pregnant and so on. So it was like we forgot all about sanity, so to speak, what we knew about pregnancy and all that. And then we had the sudden decline. And of course, you need to give yourself that question. Is this a coincidence? Is this like because of the climate, because of people don't want to have sex any longer? Or is there a connection to the vaccine which were given, although it was an experimental injection, it was given to the whole population?
One thing, just real quick, the Office of Vital Statistics is what we call it in the United States.
Yeah.
Is this something that if you look at live births, it tends to be quite stable, or are there fluctuations over the course of a year or 18 months?
There is a fluctuation over the years, you can say. But if you look again in Denmark, this was actually checked data because we couldn't have the Danish data. That's also very important, because I think we need transparency. I think we need to have access to all these vital data. We would love to have access to US data also, of course. But there is a fluctuation, but this was like a rapid decline, and that is very rare. And also that this is like a period of 27 months. So it's not just on a monthly basis. So we saw a signal in Denmark, and it kept falling. And at the same time, which I think is important, is that the amount of women in the childbearing age were actually getting higher because of immigration and all that. So it was like even a bigger change in the birth rate, so to speak. So we had the signal, but we had to find out a way of getting the data. We couldn't have the Danish data; they denied us the data, so we had the Czech data and
from the Czech Republic.
from a FOIA, yes, from the Czech Republic.
Okay, so it wasn't Danish
No,
data.
but the thing is, this is like an international phenomenon that you have the declining birth rate. Sorry, I'm going like that. I have to get up a little. Sorry.
But the
yeah.
Czech data, I read the manuscript. The Czech data, 1.3 million base population, appears very reliable. So I mean, in terms of fewer babies being born, that part of it is clear. Right? I mean,
exactly. That's very obvious. And also it is an international phenomenon. I mean, you have it in US also, that you have a declining birth rate, as far as I know.
But hasn't this gone on for a long time where it's kind of edging down?
No, it has been going on a little before also, but this was like a rapid decline. So this was like something suddenly hit you, because you have over the years, and you have at one point, but this was like, it was going stable, steady, and then suddenly.
But wait a minute, it didn't happen in 2020 when we just had the infection alone?
No, it didn't. I mean, when we had that, people could stay home and have sex.
It takes.
What do you think they did when they stayed home?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
They're kind of locked down, but
Exactly.
it takes 9 months to make a baby.
Yeah.
So now it makes sense that you don't see this drop off until December of 2021, almost 12 months after the rollout, and it took an uptake.
Yeah.
And do you think people in the childbearing years, do you think they were starting to take the vaccine by February and March and April of that?
And that's also a point, because when we look into Czech data, we see that the big amount of women in the childbearing age started in June 21. And that's also what our number shows, that it's actually approximately 9 months after that, you have an even bigger difference between the birth rate of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
Well, wait a minute then. So if that's the case, then remember it. We start from conception to ultimately carrying the baby. But on that type of time schedule, what could be happening clinically is actually fetal loss. So could be miscarriages, stillbirth.
But that's more difficult to get those numbers also. But that's also a part of it. Why didn't they give birth, and when did they lose maybe a pregnancy early in the pregnancy? But all we can see, and this is like hard numbers, this is like nothing. I mean, where we have our project with the side effects, you could say, well, it wasn't reported, or it wasn't doing this and that. But either you have a child or you don't have a child. It's not like, oh, were there a child or wasn't there? It's like the same with death. Like, that's a very strong endpoint. So a born baby is also a strong endpoint. But of course, there could be something in between, like were there a loss early in the pregnancy? That we don't know. But we certainly know that there's a strong signal. And for me, I think it's important also to keep the common sense and say, okay, we didn't know anything about what would happen to women in the childbearing age, or men for that case. So of course, we need to be, I would say, keeping an open mind to find out whether it did hurt. And what I think is stressful is that we don't have access to these data. I would love to have access to US data, of course, because we should have that transparency. We should have, I think we have a right to know what happened to the population when we had these experimental injections being spread.
So just a few kind of definitional elements of this. So when we talk about the data that we do have, this is just live births that are recorded. Okay, and we don't really know anything else. It's
we don't know whether there were more like miscarriages or this and that. We are trying to get those numbers because, of course, our idea is that there is a connection. And then we don't know the causality also. I mean, it doesn't say that, oh, well, you had the vaccination against COVID-19, so that's why you can't have a child. But what we know, and what is has been published, and what we also can see on the data from the databases with the side effects, is that many, many women had bleeding disturbances. So many women had the bleeding disturbances because of the vaccine. And if you have a bleeding disturbance, of course, then your fertility is not the same. I mean, you know that even if you're not a doctor or women, anyone knows that if you have a disturbance of your, your bleedings, of course, your fertility will change.
So an irregularity in the menstrual cycle correlates with a loss of fertility.
Always,
of course,
because it's a very delicate cycle from ovulation, and then the egg is traveling down the fallopian tube, and it has to meet perfectly with the sperm at the right time, and then that has to happen, and then ultimately implantation. So anything that throws off the timing there always leads to it's a one-way street.
Well, no, wait a minute. I'm sorry to be obtuse, but why isn't okay? So the ovulation is shifting around over time in the cycle, but I mean, if there are potential conception exposures throughout this erratic cycle, why does it make any difference?
Because if it's thrown off even by a day, John, the uterus isn't ready. So even if egg and sperm meet, it doesn't find a uterus that's perfectly ready to receive the gift and have that embryo take hold. So it just passes through.
I see.
So anything that messes up the cycle from ovulation to sperm and egg, that's conception, to ultimately implantation. And so this fertility cycle is one of the most exquisitely timed events in all of biology.
And usually goes like on a daily basis. Usually it's like very strictly, you can put your clock on when you have your, when you're fertile and all that. So I think, I mean, it's definitely not a good thing. If you want to be pregnant, it's definitely not a good thing to have bleeding disturbance.
Okay.
Right, but we have two papers, one by Gatt in the journal Andriology, another one from the Chinese that was published in JAMA, showing that two indices of male fertility go down with vaccination: the sperm count and sperm motility. So this is important. Those are the two major ones. They drop for about 6 months after COVID vaccination, and then they rebound. So, this is the setup. And I imagine if in the Czech data, live birth rates did not drop and they were consistent all the way through, we wouldn't have an investigation.
No, exactly.
But we're investigating it because of this objective drop. It literally just falls off a shelf around the time that people who took vaccines, were exposed to vaccines, should have been having babies, on time. Suddenly the babies don't come.
And another very strong point is that when we look into this, it's quite a big amount of data. When we look into it, we can see that the women who wasn't having had the vaccination, they didn't have a drop in the birth rate. So the women who had a drop in the birth rate was only women who were vaccinated, which shows that we have had that drop in the birth rate, not only in Denmark and the Czech Republic, we have had it in many countries, which shows that there is some kind of causality, because if it was a drop for all women, then we would have a drop among the non-vaccinated.
Is vaccinated women as a variable in the Czech data?
Yeah.
Is that solid?
That's very solid. That's very solid. Yeah.
Okay. So,
and how was that collected? I mean, what was the method for that survey data? Because I was under the impression that this very fine distinctions in data are perhaps not that easy to obtain.
It is actually, because the Republic of Czech is very close to what Denmark is. So we have a very strong overview of the population because we have the numbers which follows you. So you kind of have a very strong overview of the population. So you know who was vaccinated, who wasn't vaccinated, and we know who gave birth and didn't give birth. So it's different than it is in the US. I think it would be more difficult here, but it's very close. So in that way, it's very solid data.
So just to explain to our audience, the United States CDC has not released the vaccination data that they hold. They haven't actually even told us what type of data do they hold. So what's on the CDC website is actually what John said, survey data. Did you take a vaccine? Are you likely to take a vaccine? It's not, did you get a recorded vaccine? And what you're telling us in the Czech Republic data, they know.
They know exactly. They know
who took the shot and who didn't.
Yeah.
And so, this being said, how big of a drop in live births occurred in the vaccinated?
It was around 30% different from the non-vaccinated women.
Oh my Lord!
Yeah, so it's like, and what is
huge.
And what is the most concerning thing is, well, it's concerning by itself, but also, will it stay that way? So kind of when, someone like Elon Musk or anyone else says that they're worried about the humanity and will we, die out and all that, it should concern you, because we saw this drop. And of course, cross fingers, we hope that it will, be reversible. So we will get back to normal.
At that time, John, historically, haven't we in, the last 5 decades, haven't we just been on this monotonic reduction in fertility in westernized countries?
Well, I think that it entirely depends on the population demographics. I mean, if amongst college-educated women in Europe and in the United States, there has been a steady decline. Now, where that's the waters are muddied from immigrant populations that do still have high levels of fertility. And one theory or one concept of this policy that seems to have been implemented by governments in the EU and in the United States, actually encouraging mass immigration. Now, why it's not just done lawfully through normal legislative process, I don't know. But the idea is that if we're going to maintain our labor supply, we're going to have to get people who want to have children coming into the country. So the range of fertility is a major demographic question as well. But you take, for example, Spain and Italy, Spanish and Italian girls who are ethnic Spanish girls or Italian girls, they're just not having children, and they're not in Japan either.
Wow. Well, let me ask.
And I think that's a point, because that's also important to say. When we have a difference in the birth rates, is of course not only because of the vaccination. I must say, because we had infertility or the problem in some sort before also, but the rapid decline is related, and as I say, it didn't make it better. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's for sure. Vibeke, now, do the Czech data, would they include migrants who've come into the Czech Republic?
They include everyone. They I mean, they include everyone. And the thing is also, someone will say, well, it's because the women were wise. So they knew that they were going to get pregnant. So they said, no, thank you to the vaccination. But we have to remember, that about half of all pregnancies are non-planned for. So it's like, what happened? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, the push of getting the vaccinations was so strong. So the government and the Czech Republic is very strong on that. So the push on the women to get vaccination was very strong. And usually you will talk about the healthy vaccine bias, that people who get a vaccination, that's what people have said, with the vaccination, that they're more healthy.
Yeah, so healthier people.
But here you must say, if that is the case, that seems to be the opposite, that they were less healthy. But I think that for most, they were more or less the same. That we don't know with the social groups and all that, but we know that they should be more or less the same. So something happened along the way. And the only thing we can point to, and which has an kind of an explanation with the bleeding disturbances and all that, is the vaccination.
By the end of 2021 in the Czech Republic, roughly what percent of the population studied were vaccinated?
By the end of, I think that was like in Denmark about 90%.
And same in the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
What about mid 2021?
Mid 2021. I mean, that's the thing. That's where they had the bulk. That's where they started to vaccinate most of them. And that's why we know that before June 21, you also had women being in the childbearing age, having the vaccination, but that was mainly the health personnel and doctors,
Okay.
and teachers. And then the big amount started in around June, and we can see that also on the numbers.
Another thing that I think is important to define is we have the EU countries, and we talked about this in my interview with you a couple of years ago. So if I understand correctly, it's the pharmaceutical approval agency in Germany that is being tasked with analyzing the vaccines that were then rolled out for the rest of the European Union. Is that correct?
No, I mean,
Who did the biologics analysis of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine?
That was the European Medical Agency who did that.
But it's in Germany, is it not?
No, it's in Amsterdam.
It's in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Oh, it was. I think actually it was in London, and then when we had the Brexit, then they came to Amsterdam. It's definitely not in Germany.
They have representatives from,
but the office is in Amsterdam.
The EMA.
I said Antwerp.
EMA is made up of a lot of subunits of different
But
countries.
but they did that, and they made an experiment. They made emergency authorization of it. And what I think is interesting is that, and we tried to ask him about that several times. Now you're talking about it, is that they literally said on the emergency authorization that we didn't have any scientific proof that it did anything to transmission. So they actually said that this is like a private thing. This is for you not to get serious ill or hospitalization, but we don't know anything whether it will protect against transmission to me of the infection. And despite that, all the governments went out and said to the public, this will get normal life back. This will help a grandmother not to get the infection if you get the vaccination. So they actually lied to the population because they said when they had the emergency authorization, we don't know anything about transmission. Despite that, they went out and told the public that this will do something to the transmission. And I think that's very important because lots of these women took the vaccination because they thought that they would save someone.
That they were going to protect somebody else.
They thought that they were going to protect the vulnerable, the old ones, the disabled people, and so on. And that was a big lie.
Well, I mean,
I think that's worrying.
It was the same thing in the United States, where CDC Director Rochelle Walensky came out in August of 2021 and said, well, it would seem that these vaccines don't prevent transmission and infection, which I think did come as a surprise for most people.
I think so.
I think it certainly
did.
But the reason why I asked about the EU, the Czech Republic, now being a member of the EU, did the people of the Czech Republic receive the same vaccine deliveries that Ursula von der Leyen negotiated with Albert Bourla?
Yeah, they had and that's also interesting because, we have our batch study showing that there was a batch dependency, especially from the Pfizer, which were given mostly to us in Denmark. And that's the same case in the Czech Republic, that they had mostly Pfizer and more or less the same. So it was not the same batches as we had in Denmark. Some of them were, but it was exactly the same pattern. So it was all fueled, you can say, from van Leiden or from EU, but it was the same thing they went through. And one thing is that in the Czech Republic, they're very strong on the idea of having their population vaccinated. So it's and I just spoke with them because we have this close cooperation, and it turns out it's even very strong also on children's vaccination, which means that, as I was told, about 99% of the children are actually having children's vaccination, which is a huge number, which we don't have in Denmark. And I was even told that they could come and take the child away from you if you didn't agree on the vaccination. Just to show you how, I think it's important to understand how big the push was or is to get vaccination. And I think the push were a little less in the States.
Are you saying that 99% of the Czech children took a COVID vaccine?
No, sorry, no, that's the children vaccination
routine
program. Yeah, for the
vaccines.
routine. But I think that's a high number, a very high number. And that's
Yes.
also why we have been discussing whether we could go into the autism discussion and look into the data, because we have such a perfect overview of the population. But we do have a problem in the Czech Republic, because we don't have a control group. We have that in Denmark.
Well, we have so many trends going on. So
Yeah.
we had the pandemic, COVID illness, mass population vaccination, and John, we had this background wave of ever increasing childhood vaccines, and now what's become apparent is an autism epidemic.
Yes, I mean, which all of the irregularities of the COVID-19 vaccine program, I correct me if I'm wrong, but it's what raised the idea in your mind, like this whole vaccine enterprise is kind of strange, the way these guys are pressing this in such a vehement way. And so that actually prompted you to go back and examine the whole enterprise.
Right. I was very influenced by a book written by Roman Bistianik and Suzanne Humphreys, and I encourage everybody to pick up a copy. It's called Dissolving Illusions, and it's a historical accounting in great detail of vaccination of populations, starting way back with the smallpox vaccine. And now John Leake, as you know, our world's greatest historian here at the McCullough Foundation, John, I'll give you a plug, is working, on a book which I think will really tell us who were these characters that drove vaccination all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think a little digression into that, and then I do want to ask you some more questions about fertility. But I think my theme in the book is that, starting really with Edward Jenner in England at the end of the 18th century, there's this charming idea that if you expose people to a weakened, or as the started to use the Latin iteration of this, an attenuated form of a pathogen, a disease-causing agent, that weakened exposure to a weakened form would then render immunity to the disease in its full strength. And it is a charming idea. I mean, there's no question about it. You think weakened form, and then it spares people from having to undergo the trial of the full illness with possible death. Like, who wouldn't be charmed by the idea? But if you look at the history of this, what you see is there's an initial kind of being mesmerized by the idea, and then what that sets in motion is heavy bias in terms of evaluating whether it actually works. In other words, you get sold on the idea, and then in that state of being persuaded, you become very reluctant to acknowledge and to recognize and to speak about the signs that maybe it's not working so well, and maybe it's not entirely safe. Maybe it's a gamble.
And particularly when you can't identify the organism,
right,
or the bacteria or virus that is the causative agent. So back in the day, it would be, I gave a vaccine, it worked. And who was going to challenge that, John? People were ready to accept vaccines.
But having said so, I think it's the same with the corona vaccine. I mean, what did people accept? You only had one study, like 20,000 people being followed for 2 months, or young and fresh people, healthy people, and then you go out and give it to the vulnerable, to the pregnant, to the children. And I mean, for me it's the same. Like you could tell anything, and people would just say, well, just put it there, Doc. And
yeah,
so
it's true, and I wanted to touch on that with fertility. I mean, Dr. McCullough, you were the one that pointed out to me, and I wasn't even aware of this at first, that the COVID-19 vaccine, the clinical trials, it wasn't tested on pregnant women.
No.
They were
They-
excluded.
They were
Yeah,
excluded.
yeah.
And
You had
then,
to be younger and healthy
right.
and non-pregnant.
And not even childbearing age.
No.
So it's not tested on pregnant
No,
women.
no,
we
no.
don't know anything about how pregnant women are going to tolerate this. But then as soon as it rolls out with emergency use authorization, the CDC says it's not contraindicated for pregnant women. Go ahead and get it. And to me, that was the most amazing moment in this, because I mean, I entered adulthood during a period where pregnant women were very reluctant to even drink a glass of wine.
Yeah.
John,
And you had the telotomy,
listen, before the year 2000, pregnant women in the United States weren't given vaccines.
No.
So this is a relatively recent change where obstetricians said, well, go ahead and take a flu vaccine. Go ahead and take a Tdap vaccine. And it just kind of crept into modern obstetrics. However, the concern is with any vaccine during pregnancy is inflammation. A reaction can be a fever or close to a fever. And any type of systemic inflammation can trigger the mother to lose the baby. And in the first trimester, that's a miscarriage. The second trimester, it's a stillbirth. And in the third trimester, it's a premature delivery leading to a baby in the neonatal ICU. And in the vaccine inserts that pregnant women are given, and I know this for sure, they're told, listen, this can happen. The unprecedented development, though, was the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, within a few months of release of the vaccine, said, listen, take them at any time during pregnancy.
But it's like, when did we as doctors lost sanity? I mean, for me, it's crazy, because we know, and we had the catastrophe with the thalidomide, or what's it called in thalidomide, exactly. So we knew that you have to be careful. You have pregnant women are vulnerable. You said yourself, you can't have a glass of wine and all this and that. And then what happened? That suddenly we didn't have any data at all. We didn't have any science at all. And then we said, oh, well, you just go ahead. You just take 1, 2, 3, whatever you can have. And for me as a doctor, it's like, where did we lose our sanity? Where did we lose the common sense? Where did we lose all what we had learned in medical school to be that the pregnancy is vulnerable, that the unborn child is vulnerable, and then suddenly just say, oh, you just go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's in our various conversations, this is what emerges. I mean, for the longest time, we had this idea that if someone is infected and has a clinically symptomatic illness with an infectious disease, if they get through it, I think the presumption was they're going to have some immunity for some time. What I thought was remarkable with the whole COVID-19 vaccine project, particularly these messenger RNA shots, was this idea crept into public consciousness that the COVID-19 vaccines it's not an injection of the viral protein, the mRNA, in order to induce the production of the viral protein in order to induce an immune response. That would have been a logical accounting of what's going on. It was just this kind of magical idea that was presented to the public that COVID-19 vaccination is better than natural immunity. In other words, it's not inducing an immune response. It just confers better immunity than the human immune system, which was a complete departure from immunology.
Yeah.
Were there any other vaccines where that was ever the campaign?
No, exactly.
No,
Measles,
because
and you had a long period where you even couldn't talk about natural immunity. It was like a no-go. No, you can't say that.
And then you experienced this when you were at your former hospital center. You had suffered COVID-19, you've gotten through the illness, you had a PCR confirmation of it, but your hospital still insisted just a few weeks later that you get a COVID-19 vaccine.
It's true. Hospitals did this, employers did it. Even the CDC said, well, you're trying to have 90 days from when you had the infection before we, load more spike protein in the body through the vaccine. But there were 3 studies out early, Rock, Kammerer, and Methodius, all showed that if someone had COVID illness, then they take a shot, there's even more side effects, including ones that could lead to hospitalization. And those papers impressed me. I said, listen, I already had through COVID. I'm done with this. I don't want to take a shot and end up in the hospital. And I really applied that to myself. And what happened is authorities all over Europe and the United States, in a sense, threw caution to the wind. And John, historically, when do our leaders throw caution to the wind on public health issues?
Well, I would say in the modern health era, I would say starting, around 1914, as you see virology, bacteriology. Well, first of all, bacteriology and then virology developing. There's this sense of let's apply a scientific method to medicine, particularly infectious disease, the treatment of infectious diseases. And you see a kind of cautionary principle developing in medicine. But then we get to COVID-19, and that it is strange how, well, you practice medicine. I mean, this idea of conservatism, of caution. I mean, was this not?
Well, what about people in Denmark?
Yeah.
When we met in Denmark, in Copenhagen, you told me that Denmark was relatively lightly affected by COVID.
Oh yeah, we hardly had anyone dying from COVID, and we didn't have anyone dying beyond the age of 60. So it was like we had a few cases, and most of them died for some other reasons than Corona, or COVID-19. So we didn't have, but we had the same fear mongering that they had anywhere else. So it was like the same push and the same lying to the public and all that. And all I'm saying is, we always need, when you have a new thing, you need to look at the risk and the benefits. That's why you call it risk benefit. And here it was like, we only looked at the benefits. We didn't bother about the risk.
But did anybody come on Danish TV and weigh out risks?
No, we weren't allowed. I mean, I have been censored, and I think that's also a very important part here. Now we have this study out, and it influenced the whole world, you could say, at least women who got the COVID-19 vaccination. And even so, the mainstream media has censored it. I mean, it has been all over X and all that, and I'm very thankful to X and Elon Musk for giving us that opportunity, because mainstream media are actually censoring this.
But remember, X was censoring all the way through the end of 2022. It wasn't until Elon Musk when he purchased X.
That's why I'm saying I'm grateful to him.
We're live streaming on Instagram right now.
Yeah.
Instagram is still running some censorship.
Yeah.
We are live streaming on YouTube. YouTube in the last few months has just dropped their censorship, and Facebook, Instagram hasn't. And we're also on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn still has full force censorship. When we talk about censorship, that means suppression of any information on early treatment, what people can do for themselves to help themselves, and then any information on vaccine safety. Effectively, these platforms, these meta platforms, and previously Twitter, were vaccine promotional.
Exactly.
channels.
Exactly. I mean, in my point of view, they do have a responsibility for the damage made, because they were kind of they made kind of the damage because they didn't allow risk benefit. I don't know how many posts I had been, which has been taken down. The minute even our scientific work has been taken down, because that was fake information and that was, fake news. And it was like, so in my opinion, they do have a responsibility of the damage done, because we didn't have that risk benefit discussion. They didn't allow your and my and other doctors' voices. We were just, harassed, defamated, censored, and all that. And that I think they have a responsibility.
Well, what I thought was so interesting was in the era of this COVID pandemic, starting with discussions of early treatment, you were at the forefront of looking into this and trying to figure out ways to keep patients out of the hospital. The discussion of that was suppressed, and then any kind of even just expression of concern about, well, what do we know about these? Can we talk about this? The immediate answer was no, there shall be no discussion of this. What this reminded me of, go back in history, what we experienced, I think, was what I call a reversion to orthodoxy. In other words, we got away from a discussion of empirical matters of, hey, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? Let's compare notes. We go back to something that we really saw during the great religious wars of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries of no, there is an orthodoxy, in the southern part of Europe, the Catholic countries, that's issued by the papacy. And then you have the Reformation and the German and Czech lands and in the Scandinavian lands, where there's a kind of questioning of official church orthodoxy. And the response to all of this is heterodox thinking and discussion is no longer tolerated. The Holy Office of the Inquisition has a list of books that are banned. Yeah. And, we're not going to talk about these heterodox or heretical ideas. We went back to that.
Exactly.
We really did, which was absolutely an amazing moment in history where we're back to orthodoxy.
I would say it was frightening. I mean, being a scientist and you have made even more science, I think when you usually have that, well, does the numbers fit, and what are the data? I think it's frightening. I think it was not only, it was literally frightening because it was like, what did we learn? Why did we do all this? Why 2 + 2 is not 4 any longer? And for me, I don't know why that happened. The only explanation I can give is that the lobbyists, in thus, the Pfizer and in Moderna, I knew a lot of money was at stake, and for me that was some of the explanation, and the power. The fear-mongering gave the government so much power. I mean, in Denmark, it was like I felt that the prime minister, that was the joy of her life. She could say, "You just go home. I'm the big girl," So it gave someone an extreme power because they forgot all about our, constitutional rights. They forgot all about our rights for, free speech, for private, earnings, everything. And so they gave someone a very strong and dangerous power. And they gave a lot of money to some business.
World leaders all over, John, did seem to bask in this. Dr. Manniche's description of leaders in Denmark remind me of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. Remember when she said that the government will be the single source of truth?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
The single source of truth. And that took me back to a trip that I took probably about 15 or 20 years ago, where I had traveled to China and I was meeting with cardiologists, and we were pretty close to the border of North Korea. And the Chinese doctors had told me about their adventures in North Korea, that they were asked to come help the North Korean cardiologists learn some techniques. And when they crossed the border and they checked into their hotel, there was a TV set and there was a single source of news, the one channel from the North Korean totalitarian government. And that's essentially what we had. The unique thing that I think we're observing, though, it was within all countries. There wasn't a single country that said, let's hold a round table. Let's get different viewpoints on what's going on, either with treating the illness, on how to deal with the vaccines. And to this day, we've had this trickling of capitulation. I wanted to ask you this, Dr. Manniche. Recently, we've had finally the White House. We've had the intelligence community clearly we've had a smattering of senators and congressmen say that the virus came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So finally there's capitulation. Is the same occurred in Europe?
Well, I must say I was glad that when they put out about the lab leak and all that,
Right.
because I thought it was kind of giving us some of the truth back, wherever that truth may be. But the thing is, it's still in Europe. I mean, if you don't support the narrative, it's not out. So it's still like, and if they mention it, it's like, oh, that's Trump going again. He's crazy, and so they want to twist it into a negative story. So, but that's in the mainstream media. When you take it on social media, people are waking up, so to speak. People are kind of sharing information about this and that. So a lot of things is happening, but I think that's one thing which is important, and it takes me to like the spike protein. What I feel is that people are actually realizing that it has had a cost and that it didn't help, and that some of those who are vaccinated actually got more sick than the unvaccinated. But what I think is a problem, and that is we need to find a treatment, because I can see that whenever you mentioned it, someone will say, okay, that's right, that's me, that's not good, but what can I do? So I don't want to listen. So we need to kind of go in and see, well, there is a causality of some kind. We need to find out how to get rid of the spike protein. So, because it's like the minute they get a chance to do something against, to solve the problem, then I think the population will listen more. But as it is now, at least in Denmark, we can't give them any treatment. We can say, well, for sure, you hurt yourself. You may have, circulating spike proteins. What to do? So I think the minute we get something more, solid, where we can say, take this or do this and that, and the spike protein and the damage will go away, then I think more people will listen.
Well, let me tell you, since we're live streaming on Instagram, I have to tell you this. In 2023, when we published the very first version of McCullough Protocol-based spike protein detoxification, which is a proposal based on the preclinical and available clinical data of using nattokinase, bromelain, and curcumin in combination. This was published in the Journal of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. And I posted it on Instagram. It was instantaneous where that got tagged a note on it. It says, this doesn't work.
No.
And I thought to myself, wait a minute, that was too fast. Who knows already, this has just been published, that it doesn't work?
No, exactly.
So, John, this brings up a suspicion here that this biopharmaceutical complex that we outline in our book, Courage to Face COVID-19, that they're actually a couple steps ahead of us the entire time.
Well, it was like what Tucker Carlson observed in his interview with you in May of 2021. You pointed out that early it appeared that hydroxychloroquine had some antiviral and certainly some anti-inflammatory effect. I mean, it's used against rheumatoid arthritis, so it's kind of a good candidate for reducing inflammation. And you said, immediately, for example, Australia made it a jailable offense for doctors to prescribe it. And Tucker Carlson, with his characteristically good instinct, says, well, how did they already know?
How did they know? In fact, the very first TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration, set of guidelines of what to do with COVID was about 12 things where it says, do not do this. Do not do that. They didn't say what to do.
Exactly.
And so here we are in the United States, where there's not a single medical institution that has a protocol to deal with long COVID or vaccine injury syndromes. What about Denmark?
Exactly the
But
same. And I think
if I could interject real quick, because this is important. Remember in 2005, a couple of years after the first SARS-CoV-1 came out of China. Now, it didn't go that far. It was more virulent, but it wasn't that transmissible. The NIH actually published papers in which they identified in 2005 hydroxychloroquine
That's right.
is having some antiviral effect against the first SARS-CoV. So it almost looks like, I mean, it certainly raises the suspicion these guys had decided on the vaccine, a monolithic vaccine response. And so a portfolio of possible early treatment agents were identified and prescribed. Like we don't
listen. If the community starts to get on hydroxychloroquine, we better
Slam
kill
it.
it.
Yeah.
Now, ivermectin in Pierre Corey's book, aptly titled "The War on Ivermectin," the American Medical Association in the summer of 2021 launched a campaign, John, to abolish the use of ivermectin. Why would a doctor's advocacy group want to abolish a drug that we're finding useful? And of course, the FDA launched a complete false information campaign on ivermectin. They were sued by Dr. Mary Telly Bowden, Robert Epter, and Paul Merrick, and the FDA backed down. And you have the same things going on in Denmark, right?
Not exactly the same. I mean, then again, Denmark is small, but we had that you couldn't use it, but people would get it. But what I think, and going, they would get it, on the internet or whatever. But going back to the thing about how do we have a treatment in for the corona, for the vaccinated damage, and we don't. But the first thing is that the doctors are not allowed to, acknowledge that this is actually a side effect. So it's like either it's long COVID or it's nothing. But and I think that's disrespectful for all the thousands and thousands of people who has been hurt by the vaccination. Also, not only women losing their fertility, maybe just for a while or forever. I think it's so disrespectful that you gave and you pushed this so hard, and you don't have the respect for the people who has been vaccine injured. And we know that. We know that from our studies. We know that from other studies. Some of them had died. Some of them will die. Some of them has got very serious side effects. And I think that's disrespectful that you don't acknowledge the damage. And when you acknowledge that you don't try and find a treatment. And that's why I'm saying that our studies and others are so important, because we need to know the damage, which damage has been done. And when we know the damage, we need to know the causality. What happened? Was it the circulating spike protein? Was it in the heart? Was it in the immune system? What happened? And then we need to find a treatment, or at least try to find a treatment. But when we kind of blindfold ourselves and the public, then we will never find a treatment. So I think it's so important to focus on the side effects, the backside of what we did, and also to help respectfully the people who has been damaged.
We've been talking to Dr. Vibeke Manniche from Copenhagen, Denmark, here at the McCullough Foundation, Dr. Peter McCullough, and our author, historian, and board member, John Leake. John, do a time check in the upper left-hand corner of the screen right there, John, is the red. Where are we at?
It is at 54 minutes and 21 seconds on the live stream.
We are going to, at this point in time, take a break for our recorded audience, and we're going to thank Dr. Manniche for this wonderful interview. This will play on Focal Point's Substack, as well as America Out Loud Talk Radio McCullough Report. Then after this break, we're going to pick up with an extended bonus conversation, because I have some critical questions to ask of Dr. Manniche regarding her vital work on why some people are damaged and some people are not after vaccination. But thank you so much for joining us. We're going to pause right here